Happy New Year, Amy.
Happy New Year. Well, ultimately, we want to know what's the chance we will hit a recession in 2024. So parcel that out for us. How do we define recession?
Yeah, so recession is generally defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. So that's 6 months of the year back to back where the economy is shrinking. I don't think that's going to happen in Windsor, but I think the broader question for Canada and Ontario, it's an open question still. And your previous interview talked a lot about, how mortgage rates are, and inflation are major pressures on the economy. And most importantly, pressures on people and how they think about the economy, which is just as important in a lot of cases as like what the actual numbers are doing. Because if people think the economy's bad, they're less likely to spend. They're less likely to, go out for an extra meal or put something on their credit card, and that helps then trickles through the economy. And we're sort of seeing hints of that locally. I don't know if you've been to Devonshire Mall recently, but there's a couple stores that were having sort of going out of business sales there right before the New Year's. There's been some talk downtown, some restaurants and things like that have closed up. And so there's feeling that a recession could come. But like the Conference Board of Canada before the end of the year said, Windsor's going to have one of the strongest economies in Canada, and we're building a bridge, we're building a battery plant, we're trying to build homes, we're trying to build, infrastructure, and, we're attracting a lot of people to our community, which should buttress our community from recession in our region. But it doesn't mean that people won't feel the pinch this year going forward.
Yeah, you look at Canada, but I feel like Windsor's story is very different because, as you mentioned, we sort of have this economic boom coming. We have the bridge, as we know. We also have the battery plant and a lot more announcements expected around that. So when we talk about even recession or we talk about inflation, Windsor's story, how can you explain to listeners how our story might be a bit different and how we as Windsorites have to look at the economic system different?
Yeah, I think, part of it is how you feel about the community will be where you're working and what you do, right? If you're in a skilled trades or you're building something right now in Windsor, times are good, right? And you go back to 2008, it was the exact opposite, right? It was, you could buy a house for $40,000 back then, right?
I think some people miss those days.
Yeah, I think some people do. And so I think, Windsor's always been a sort of bellwether community for the economy in some ways. We've been tied to the auto sector and the boom bust of that cycle. That seems to be breaking with a lot of the infrastructure announcements and investments in our community and hopefully the diversification of our economy that may come with that. But I do think, we have to be mindful of it is quite possible that the rest of Canada goes into recession. And then if all the news is bad economic news and all you see and hear from the rest of the country is bad, that's going to impact what Windsorites do with their money too. Because, naturally there'd be well, let's save a little bit extra for a rainy day, or let's pay down our mortgage a little quicker or pay off some debt rather than going on a vacation, rather than going and spend it in the local community.
Yeah, it seems almost like as I sit here as a journalist, I think it's our duty to make sure that we separate Windsor's story from what's actually happening in the rest of the country.
Yeah, and it's sometimes hard to do that.
Correct,
the data isn't always easy to parse out what is Windsor's little piece of this.
Wouldn't that be great?
You
Make
can
your
do
job
it.
easy.
It would. It really would. You wouldn't need to talk to me, I think. So, but I think one of the challenges is really, as a region, we have a lot going for us right now. But one of the challenges is, we're so interconnected. And I think, 2024 is a presidential election in the U.S. Who knows what happens with that election? And, could we be thinking about NAFTA 3.0 if Donald Trump is reelected again because he doesn't like something that's happening now? Those are all things that are on the horizon that'll impact Windsor, particularly in 2024.
We continue to see inflation rise and paychecks aren't changing, obviously. So how sustainable is that trajectory?
Depends how you define sustainable, right? And going back to the question of the first thing cut is discretionary spending. People don't go out for dinner, or they don't go to the movies, or they don't buy that extra thing when they're at the mall. And those things go away. And what we've seen over the last few years is debt levels rising in Canada as people have been putting things on credit cards. And now as interest rates have gone up, those payments have gone up, and that's pressuring people. About 40% of homeowners in Canada this year, and this is nationally, we don't know what the number is locally, are up for mortgage renewal. And so if you're on a standard mortgage of a 5-year term, your last interest rate was, 1, 2, 3%. And now you're looking at renewing at 4, 5, 6, 7% potentially. That's going to impact a lot of people, in just how much money they have in their pocketbook to spend at the end of the week or end of the month on discretionary things. And so one of the real pinch points in our community this year to watch is, what does that small business, small community, small economy look like? Certainly there are people who are going to do very well this year. We saw the auto workers, for example, in their new collective bargaining get big pay raises. If you're in the auto sector and you got a big pay, that's amazing. But, if you're making minimum wage or you're making even a living wage, which is now just barely over $19 an hour, you're struggling to get by. And as rents go up, as inflation continues, your previous interview said, inflation's not going to go away. It's just going to rise at a much lower rate next year or this year. That's going to be a real pinch point for a lot of people in our community.
What can you glean from housing start information that you have?
Yeah, so it's been estimated that we need to build over the next decade in Windsor-Essex as a region about 32,000 new homes to sort of quote unquote restore affordability. Last year, and numbers are only available from January through November. December's numbers will be out middle of January this year in the next month or so. Across the region, we built about 1,800 new homes were completed last year. So, 32,000 divided by 10 is about 3,200. We had about 1,800 completions, between 1,800 and 1,900 completions with a month to go. We'll probably get another couple hundred units out of that, but we're not going to get to 3,200. Housing starts, which is a predictor of completions because you have to start building before. We only had about 1,000 between January and November. And within the city of Windsor represents about half to a third of those numbers. So, across the region, we're at pace. We're not at pace. Within the city of Windsor, which has its own separate target for some of the federal and provincial dollars that are out there, we're also not at pace. We're hitting about a third of what we need to in our community. So it's going to be a challenge to bring housing starts up to pace and get them back on track.
You recently wrote a blog where you said we haven't seen many reno evictions. Why is that?
Well, so
compared to other cities,
yeah,
correct? So we are seeing some, but
there are some, and I think data's hard to parse on this.
Right.
One of the challenges, Windsor's housing market now, and particularly the rental market, looks a lot like Hamilton's and Waterloo's did just before COVID, when their housing markets were some of the first to take off. As people were moving away from Toronto and into those, sort of what are quote unquote bedroom communities of the GTA, their markets, and they started seeing those rise as, in 2019 and into 2020, and then through sort of the COVID periods. And so our market looks a lot like we have a 1% vacancy rate, which means there's pretty much no rental stock to put in. You can talk to, shelter providers, for example, and trying to find housing for people is a challenge. And so what you now have, and traditionally Windsor's rental stock has been geared to sort of lower income, lower quality stock. And that's not to say that these are bad places to live. It's just they didn't have the fancy amenities. But now that you have a really tight supply, there are opportunities for some landlords to choose to, we want to renovate and now rent at a much higher rate because they can. And so this is something that I'm watching for in 2024. You can parse some of this from data that comes out from CMHC around rental numbers and sort of turnover rates and looking at that geographically. But it's one of those things that is something to watch in 2024.
All right. We have to leave it there because of time, but it's clear from our conversation there's lots to talk about. And I think as we move forward and as the landscape nationally changes, it's really important for us to have these conversations, to sit down and see, are we with the nation on this, or is Windsor paving its own path?
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks so much, Frazier. Frazier Fathers, he's the lead consultant and researcher with Community Policy Solutions in Windsor.